No? All right, well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor and pleasure to be here and speak in front of the audience of colleagues in a wider sense. So I guess my talk and Dan's that is to follow will be responsible for the multidisciplinarity part of the symposium. And as you may see from the title, the talk is not going to be exactly in the same domain as the previous panels, because primarily we are talking about linguistic minorities in northern Eurasia, that many of them are not written languages. So if you may try to transport yourself into the reality of languages and cultures that lack written form whatsoever, and imagine the reality of vertical transmission of knowledge within the purely oral or initial, the original form of the existence of a language and culture, because as we know, writing is a very, very recent invention and adaptation of the existence of language. So I was asking myself a question about how what I'm going to present relate to the previous discussion, and I came to an interesting conclusion, because in the context of Russia and Muslim world, my presentation is going to be neither about Russia in the popular understanding of the term, nor about Muslim world, because I'm going to speak about the linguistic and cultural communities that represent primarily shamanistic and animistic kind of religious practices. But what I also see is that my presentation will probably contribute to your vision of Russia and Central and Northern Eurasia not as a homogeneous entity, where Russia is typically perceived in the context of a rich cultural and literary tradition of St. Petersburg and Moscow and Kazan, and on the other hand, Muslim tradition in Russia is normally associated with Kazan, of course, and Caucasus, and of course Central Asia, whereas Siberia, which is going to be the main area of my discussion today, represents actually the border of the northernmost expansion of Islam, and many of the communities, Turkic-speaking communities that I'm going to briefly mention today, they are actually the communities that did not fall under the Islamic conversion, or are in different ways still combining the original cultural and religious traits with a new either Christian or Islamic. We are going to discuss the languages and cultures of so-called endangered minorities of Northern Eurasia, and these are minority linguistic and cultural communities that whose habitat covers, in my case, the huge expanse of land that borders the Arctics in the north and what is now Kazakhstan and Central Asia in the south, and is located between the Ural Mountains in the west and Yenisei River in the east. So I will probably preach to the choir when I briefly discuss the premise of the importance of this documentation and analysis work and working with indigenous languages in the region, and I will preface it with this very brief global statistics that, according to various estimates in the Ethnologue and other sources, the current number of languages spoken in the world is somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000, which in itself presents a very interesting phenomenon that we don't really know how many languages are there in the 21st century. What we do know is that exactly 100 years ago, when the counting started, there were around 15,000 languages. And we also know that according to estimates, by the end of the 21st century, the number of languages will be exactly half of the current, so around 3,000. So if you consider the rate of extinction of languages and linguistic diversity, it's truly shocking. And I gave my sad estimates in the on the left side of the slide, where you can see that the rate is approximately 30 languages per year. Of course, it's kind of arithmetic approximation. What we also know is that around 90% of the languages in their existence in the world now do exist in their original form of spoken and unwritten languages. So we are really now faced with a situation where in reality, if we count the languages, not the speakers of the languages, but the languages per se, the majority of them exist in non-literary, non-written, non-literary form. So, in the context of the value of the studies of minority languages, it's of course, again, I probably do not need to convince you, but as a premise, I would like to emphasize that linguistic diversity is increasingly an object of study for various disciplines, including linguistics, philosophy, psychology, and cognitive studies, as it gives insights into diversity and boundaries of human cognitive capacities. And of course, every language in its oral form presents a unique human knowledge on nature and culture that exists and being transmitted across generations in its original form, and it's accumulated and adapted to a particular landscape or particular environment over thousands of years. And in Siberia, very often language is the single source of information for understanding human cultural evolution and history, because especially in Western Siberia and very often in Central Asia in general, there is oftentimes absence of other sources of information that could be recovered from other sources such as archaeology and other ways. So linguistic interaction in the region is very interesting in the sense that it gives us an insight into the mutual enrichment of these cultures and the innovations in both material culture and, of course, linguistic systems, where languages can provide us evidence for this interaction and show that throughout the history this area has been an arena of very active interaction of the languages and cultures of very different genetic affiliation. In terms of Northern Eurasia and its minority languages and its linguistic diversity, we can speak of over 100 minorities of various types, indigenous or diaspora types, that belong to very diverse genetic affinities, Ugric group, Samoyedic, Yeniseian, Turkic, Tungusic, all of which locally represent vast dialectal divergence and local variation, to the extent that the dialects of these languages are not mutually comprehensible to the speakers and represent a very, very diverse systems in linguistic terms. What we also have at the moment is that all of these languages are in different stages of language shift and language loss, and this is the result of extended bilingualism over the last century at least, where almost all the speakers are native speakers of at least two languages, and many of them they're legacy speakers, so to say, so they learn their mother tongue as a second language actually. So they all currently use Russian as the widest functional domain, and where their mother tongue, their native languages, are restricted to very limited functional domains. Another important feature is that all of the speakers in most of the cases reside discontinuously. That is to say, they, if you're familiar with the history of the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 70s, there was a policy of enlargement, so to say, where small settlements and villages were eliminated and people were moved to larger settlements, under the pretense of providing of social security and education and health services. So in every case, the speakers of these languages, they represent a small minority in the settlements, villages where they reside. So numbers of speakers are also very indicative. So many of the languages that I'm going to mention today have less than 10 speakers, and that is across multiple dialects. And some of them, many of them, they have speakers less than 500, again across multiple dialects, and very, very few of them have more than 1,000 or even 5,000 speakers, and these are the largest minorities, which are nevertheless, again, very diverse. So in many cases you can speak of multiple languages. And another feature finally is that most of the speakers, proficient speakers of these languages, they are chronologically advanced, so they represent people aged over 60, and as such, these cultures, they represent really interesting and sad discord within the communities, where younger generation very often cannot understand the older generation. And in most of the cases, this linguistic minorities, they represent very rare but inevitably failing attempts in ethnic education projects, where at different times, especially in the 1930s and later in the 1970s and 80s, there were attempts to have these languages taught at the university or at the school level, but in prevailing majority, with very singular exceptions, these were unsuccessful attempts. So, a bit more detail in the illustrative cases about what these language minorities and speakers are. So, we are in, of course, Russia, in Central Eurasia, in the wide conception of the term, including Siberia. So, as I said, these are genetically affiliated, such as, for example, Ugric and Samoyedic. They both fall under the Uralic language family, as well as, if you believe in Altaic mega family, there are Turkic and Mongolic and Tungusic linguistic communities that are proposed to be in the remote genetic relationship to each other. But all of them, they demonstrate stark local dialectal divergence. And what is interesting in terms of research, of course, it's not a trivial task very often to identify the genetic affiliation of some of the varieties, because they combine multiple features of multiple languages that are adjacent. So, for example, in Siberia, there's an example of Yukagir or Dolgan, which combine features of various language families. In many cases, what we do is we speak about the continuum of degrees of difference and similarity between local varieties, not so much about the dialects, but local varieties of languages. In terms of history, it's, as I said, the river basins of Ob and Yenisei, and until the 15th, 16th century, these were under the administrative control of Tatar Khans, the Taibujins and Shaybanids. The initial Russian contacts date back to the 13th century, and these are trade expeditions by the Novgorod traders. First campaigns of exploration, so to say Wild East conquest, date back to the 16th century, and the large-scale expansion is in the 17th century, and of course the most tragic and decisive effect, assimilative effect on many languages was in the late 20th century due to the exploration of oil and gas reserves in Siberia and in northern Central Asia. An interesting example of early kind of sequential art about the history of Siberia are the early accounts of the Russian imperial adventurers and administrators, including Semyon Remezov, who produced the so-called Atlas of Siberia. And here, in a very accessible form, you have a very interesting historical progression from Kuchum Khan, control over the territory, then of course Yermak Timofeyevich liberating the local indigenous communities from the oppression of the Tatars, and instead of paying fur tax to the Tatars, indigenous communities now paid fur tax to the Russian Tsars, and that's the essence of the change. There is also an interesting account of diversity of indigenous communities, and that is actually very interestingly representative, because I don't know if you can see it, in a very brief form, Remezov represented the three main cultural and subsistence types, and that is the Turkic communities in the south, the horse riders, so to say, and then the forest hunter-gatherers of the taiga forest who rode on the dog sleighs, and of course the northern nomadic reindeer herders of the tundra. Remezov also was accurate enough to represent that the conquest was not always a friendly campaign, where the inclusion of the indigenous communities into the Russian Empire was oftentimes accompanied by armed conflicts and with very sad consequences for indigenous communities, of course, because of the sheer numbers and, of course, the difference in military technology. A brief insight into what kind of languages do we have. As I mentioned, there are Turkic languages towards the south, and these are varieties of Tatar, but it's called Siberian Tatar or Chat Elshta. There are different dialects. They're quite distinct from standard Kazan Tatar, and an interesting detail now is that nowadays they are under heavy assimilative pressure, not from Russian but from standard Tatar, because there are multiple educational campaigns from Kazan trying to bring these different local varieties to a standard. But also further south, there are Chulim Turks that represent very interesting hunter-gatherer Turkic-speaking cultures that were never introduced to Islam, unlike Siberian Tatars. And also further south, there are communities of Teliut that until recently were considered a dialectal variant of Hakas, but actually it represents a quite distinct linguistic idiom of the region, and Teliuts were actually Christianized, and so many of them are Orthodox Christians. The next group is Obugric communities, and these are Mansi and Hanti, the worst hit by the curse, the resource curse, and both of these communities, they represent a huge dialectal variation. The next is a so-called Samoyedic branch of Uralic languages, and many of these languages, they're really in their last speakers, especially Selkup, but also Enets and Ganasan. Further down, there is this interesting phenomenon in Siberia, the isolate cat, Yeniseic, the only survivor of Yeniseic language family that has recently been discussed in the context of affinity between the Northern Asia and Northern America, and there were multiple publications comparing Ket to Nadene, Athabascan languages, and discovering non-trivial correspondences. So this is now increasingly being used as a link and a historical evidence of the population of North America from Northern Asia. There are also Tungusic languages, and this represents, of course, the notorious Evenks who travel over huge and vast territories, migrating from northern China across Siberia and even across Ural Mountains to the northern European part of Russia. and they all, of course, leave the trace in the linguistic systems that they go over, as well as cultural features, material cultural features. So if we try to represent even this cursory look, we will see a very motley picture, so to say, of linguistic situation in northern Eurasia, in this one region of what can you say, watersheds. And this, of course, produces all sorts of interesting research questions about the history and the local, the local linguistic and cultural contexts. This is very briefly to demonstrate that most of these languages, they demonstrate major linguistic divide that corresponds to also to economic or ecosystemic divide between the tundra in the north and forest hunter-gathering economies in the south, and this coincides quite neatly with linguistic, with dialectal divisions. Yes, so I've mentioned that already, that the main feature is economic as well as contact-wise. The tundra reindeer breeders, they contact amongst themselves, whereas the forest hunter-gatherers, they're more isolated and they're exposed to their own type of contacts from the south. So yes, in the end, you can see that many of the habitats or many of the areas of each linguistic community, they overlap with others, and this inevitably produces the features of contact, both in the material culture and in language. As I also mentioned, the social organization is very archaic. It's patrilocal, patrilineal, exogamous, fratrial, and most of the clans represent the so-called river clans, extended families that are endogamous, and interestingly enough, this preference for endogamous marriage pattern translates nowadays to the preference of mixed marriages with outsiders of the linguistic community instead of insiders, which also affects the language change heavily. In terms of religion, as I mentioned, most of these communities, they represent shamanistic varieties of kind of polytheism, animism, with very complex cosmology and interaction between the human landscape and the sacred landscape, which is all, of course, reflected in the folk tradition or the linguistic domain. Very briefly, in terms of what kind of work is done in terms of documentation and archiving of these indigenous languages. Well, first of all, what is important is to bring this material and the tradition of research into the general academic discourse, and for that, a large part of the exercise is bringing it to some kind of universal format and in some sort of universally recognized international standard of notation. The work that has been done with our research team was focused on this set of languages. The top two are Uralic, the top three are Uralic, Kyrgyz, Yeniseic, and the bottom three are Turkic varieties of Siberia. And yeah, so the challenges are multiple, and some of them are technological, some of them are methodological and theoretical, and that is a challenge, of course, when you try to introduce it into the domain of the research projects with participation of students, because there is quite a serious challenge in terms of modern technology and software for developing the databases for linguistic analysis, and of course the fundraising for the projects, which is not an easy task. Yeah, I will just skip that. So what we try to do is we try to basically invent the written form, the literary form of existence of these languages with the help of modern documentation technology. So this is the result of the dictionary that is produced based on the analysis of the text. So we gloss and annotate texts. What we also do is we make use of the modern multimedia documentation technology, where we have an advantage of representing language in its multimodal form with the gesture, video, and other forms of communication, including distance between the speakers, which can be very interesting in terms of research topic. So I will run you very briefly through. These are the grants that I'm supposed to acknowledge. The very recent projects include the documentation of this 3 adjacent dialects of Uralic languages. All of them are, the number of speakers are under 5, and that's something that we've been doing for the last 4 years with the help of LGB projects from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And another ongoing project hosted by Nazarbayev University is the documentation of the 3 Turkic languages spoken in the region bordering Kazakhstan and Siberia. So the activities are primarily threefold. So it's documenting what has been done before, so it's legacy material documentation, and of course collection of new material in the field from the last speakers, and uniting it all within the framework of a single database that will be available for academic community and those interested, of course. So just very briefly, we produce the dictionaries by basically digitizing and annotating the existing kind of analog documentation. Yes, and we also try to save the audio material and make these multimedia databases where we have multi-language annotation as well as video and audio, and unite it all under this within the single framework of a database. Yes. Right, so this is the ELDP picture of what the languages currently being described throughout the world, and you may see that not many of them are in northern Eurasia, and half of these dots represent the projects that we run. And as I mentioned, there are 2 projects in current operation. Okay, and yes, so we've been here. In terms of linguistic research, there are a number of projects that you can do, a number of research questions that you can answer based on the material collected and processed within these databases. And so many of them are, of course, purely linguistic in terms of grammar and lexicon, but also pedagogical materials could be developed, and again, some of the revitalization efforts could be supported with that. Okay, so so we are at the doorway of Kazakhstan these days. So half of our research team is now based at Nazarbayev University, and we're going to expand our activities in Kazakhstan using this infrastructure and the experience, right? And that's where we probably will benefit from research cooperation with the colleagues at the University of Arizona, and if there is any interest, we will be happy to collaborate. So, and with this, I will probably finish and pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much.